Reconsider Christ podcast provides real-life examples on how Christ works to interact with our lives. Our guests paint on the canvas of life their stories of joy, heartache, struggle, and victory. You will learn more about the true nature of Christ, for it is time to reconsider Christ. What happens when a hard-drinking, power-hungry workaholic gets a new boss who is a holy roller nutcase? The answer is shocking, as most of the possible results are not good. Rick Boxx walks us through this pivotal moment in his career, which eventually led to a 20-plus year consulting business, helping Christian business leaders integrate their faith into the workplace. Rick didn't have much time for Christ as a young adult building his career. However, while vacationing in Hawaii, Rick found himself carried out a mile offshore by a riptide. Realizing he was at great risk of drowning, Rick decided all he could do was pray to God. Rick will tell us how this changed his life forever. Rick's book, Unconventional Business, explains how Rick integrates spiritual truth into everyday business decisions. A great book worth your time to read. Now let's hear from that hard-drinking, power-hungry workaholic. Well, hello, Rick. It's so exciting to have you on our podcast today.
Well, thank you, Gene. I appreciate being on here with you.
And I'm very excited about just the perspective that you bring today with the creation, and now over 20 years ago, of your business, Unconventional Business Network, because I think you are living exactly what I am challenging employers and employees to do. And so you're going to have a lot of great insights for us today.
Oh, looking forward to it.
Yeah. So where we normally start, we got to start with childhood and see what made you what you are today. And I think yours was pretty typical, but tell me about growing up in the Boxx house.
Yeah, well, I was in a middle-class family. My father worked on the assembly line at General Motors, didn't even finish his high school education, so he was blessed to land in a job like that. And my mother was a very devout Christian woman. And so if the church was open, we were there. Now, my dad didn't come along to that until I was about 16 or 17. But through those early years, Mom always had us in church. And so I grew up originally in kind of a Southern Baptist church. And we shifted later to a Bible denomination, but they were very similar in the nature of those churches. And so I was always around church, and had a neighborhood where we had tons of kids my age, and so a lot of close friends that I still am close with today after all of these years. Mm-hmm. So it was a fun upbringing, and just a good place in the Kansas City area in a suburb.
Mm-hmm. And so tell me, what do you remember about what you thought about God and Christ back in those days?
Yeah, because the church that I was raised in really was good at teaching the Bible. We had Bible drills and Bible memorization and all of that. And so I knew and I understood the Bible pretty well. But really, I was driven more by just trying to please my mom. And so at 8 years old, in one of those old-fashioned Southern Baptist church, they would wrap up by playing Just As I Am and doing an altar call, and they would play until somebody went forward. And so one week I felt like it was my duty to go forward and stop this stuff. And
stop the singing.
And so I don't know that I fully understood about the relational side of the relationship with Jesus. But I wanted to please my mom. I felt obligated to go forward and get baptized. And so I did that. But, so I knew the church. I knew who Jesus was. And I never really had any doubt that Jesus was Lord. I just don't think that I grasped the relational side of what all that was supposed to mean.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We'll come back to that idea of relational in a little bit after your experience with the bank president. But, that's a concept a lot of people don't understand. I think it's important to discuss. So, man, you just grew up in the suburbs, went to church, did what you're supposed to. had a unique opportunity that your parents did not have the opportunity to go to college. And so in college, what were you and Christ doing?
So if we step back a little bit right before college, or long before college, at 12 years old, I had one of those pivotal moments in life, and my family went to visit some relatives. I had a cousin that I looked up to. He was about a year older than me. And while we were there, he was getting ready to go out for the evening. And my uncle told him, "You're not going anywhere unless you take Rick with you." Well, I had no idea what was about to happen. But the next thing I knew, I was in a station wagon with about 5 or 6 guys, quite a bit older than me. And I looked in the back of the station wagon, and there was about 8 cases of beer back there. And along the way, they stopped and picked up a girl that they told me was the so-called town tramp. And so at 12 years old, that evening, I experienced my first beer, my first kiss, and my first encounter with the law, all in one night. And that really set me on a completely different trajectory in my life. And so I began living a very selfish life, a very alcohol-driven life, and just kind of a party life of whatever I wanted to do. That's what I did. And so that really carried forward with me on into college. It probably even ramped up some during the college years. And so I really was just trying to move forward in life, just doing what pleased me. And I really didn't care too much about anything else. And I remember at the time thinking that, I knew that Jesus was Lord, but I just kept telling myself, when I'm older, I'll deal with that. Let's just wait till I'm older so I can party and have fun, now. And that was really kind of my philosophy, going through college and even quite a bit beyond.
Fascinating. It's interesting. Two things. With your father not going to church with you until later in your high school years, and then other male figures in your life kind of leading a different direction, the impact that had on you. So you survived those days. Not always a given, but made it through, graduated college. And then you had a business experience, probably a very difficult one for you, but I'm sure you learned a ton from it. So, you're out of school. It's all about me. I'm going to achieve. And tell us about those first few years.
Yeah, so I graduated with an accounting degree, went to work for a large CPA firm. And when they finally handed me that CPA certificate, I remember thinking, I just achieved the only goal I have in life, and I hate what I'm doing. I've got to get out of there. And so I left public accounting, decided that I could take a run at being an entrepreneur. And so I started a car rental agency from scratch at 25 years old. The only problem is right after I opened the doors, interest rates soared to 21%. Unemployment in our area was about 13%. And I'm trying to pay back a small business loan and build a new small business from scratch in that environment. And so it was a brutal lesson. I really struggled. I tried to figure out, how am I going to make all this work? And after about a year of fighting that battle, I realized that this was not working out real well. And I had a good friend that said, Rick, if you get out now, I think you can still get out, but you wait 6 months and you're in bankruptcy. And so I ended up selling the cars, paying off the debts, and moving out of that car rental agency, and then shifted my career into banking, and ultimately wound up in the commercial lending side, running commercial lending departments for some of the major banks in our region.
And what drove you to banking?
Well, actually, I had no desire or interest in that, but the banker that was serving me with that car rental agency was a fraternity brother of mine. And as I was winding that down, he came to me and said, Rick, with your CPA background, I bet you I could get you a pretty decent job at the bank. And I didn't have anything better to do. And I'm like, okay, let's give that a try. And so I just kind of leaped into the banking space.
Yeah, yeah. Now, and what's your mode now? You are a little bit older, but are you in Christ doing anything? You still just powering ahead, trying to be successful?
Yeah, I'm just still powering ahead. And so it was all about me. And I was trying to climb the corporate ladder, and I really didn't care how I got there. I mean, I was climbing over the top of people and just, doing whatever, cutthroat things that I thought was going to be getting me ahead. And I was very highly motivated at that time by money, and just, driven a lot by just trying to make more money and climb the ladder. And then all that kind of changed. And so I had another one of those pivotal moments, but I'd been working for a bank and I was kind of getting bored because they were a very centralized and controlled environment. And so I'd learned about all I was going to learn from that place. And then a bank, a large bank called me and said, "Hey, we've got a troubled bank in our system that we need to hire a good lender to come in and help clean this bank up and turn around the loan portfolio." And so I interviewed for that position. And it was a really strange deal because after having a couple of interviews with the regional guy that was over all the banks, and then there was the CEO of the specific bank that was in trouble. And so I'd had a couple interviews with them, and we had a third interview scheduled that they had told me if all goes well, they would be extending an offer. Well, the morning of that interview, the CEO called me and said, "Hey, Rick, I wanted to give you a heads up that at our meeting tonight, there's going to be a third person from our downtown bank that's going to join us." And I said, "Well, that's fine, but why is he coming?" "I don't have a clue." And so I go to this meeting, what I thought was my final interview. It actually ended up being a hatchet job because the regional guy at this meeting announces that today the board of directors voted that Greg, this new guy to the meeting, has been announced to be the new CEO of this troubled bank.
Oh, no.
And so the other CEO's mouth drops wide open and he's like, "So are you firing me?" And they said, "Well, no, we can't do that because you're too well known in the community. So we're going to name you chairman of the local board, but you're no longer CEO." And it was just the most bizarre meeting. And I'm like, this is crazy. I thought this was an interview. And so anyway, I turned my attention to Greg, the new guy, because I said, "Well, if I might be working for you, I need to know who you are." And he said, "Well, Rick, if you choose to take this job, you probably deserve to know my priorities in life. And God's first, my family's second, and this bank is third."
Now, did he say that at the dinner?
Yes, yes, he did.
Okay, so
with his
your
boss
mind's going, yeah, your mind's going 1,000 miles an hour. You
Yeah,
just chunked the former CEO.
yeah,
He's
yeah.
dead to you.
And in my mind, I'm now listening to a holy roller. I mean, that's kind of, my
Exactly.
mindset at that time.
Not the ideal interview.
And so it was just it was a strange situation that I'm trying to sort out. And at that stage of my life, I was a workaholic, and I couldn't figure out, how does this guy think he's going to actually run a bank if it's that low on his list of priorities?
And
so
he's staying in front of the regional leadership.
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
it was just really kind of strange. And so I ended up realizing quickly that this is a troubled bank. This guy is coming in new. He needs a team that he trusts. And I didn't want to get in the middle of, being forced upon someone. And so I pulled him aside after the meeting and I said, "Look, I haven't decided whether to accept this job or not, but I'm smart enough to know that you need a team that you trust. Why don't you and I go to breakfast and let's get to know each other? And if you, after that breakfast, want me on the team, I'll probably take the job. But if you don't want me on the team, you need to man up and tell me, and I'll back away from the job in a way that doesn't get you in trouble with the regional guy." And he said, "That sounds like a great idea. Let's do that."
yeah.
And we had a great breakfast and really had a lot of things in common. And I grew to respect him fairly quickly. And I said, if you want me on your team, I'll take the job. And so I ultimately took the job, but it was unlike any job I'd ever had, because every time I would go in and try and get decisions out of this bank president, he would quote me a proverb, or he would tell me a parable and tell me how it could relate to my problem, and that I needed to go take the principle from that Bible verse and go apply it. And I'd walk out of his, office shaking my head going, did that guy really just pull a Bible out on me? And it just was so beyond anything I'd ever experienced before.
That it just had to make your head hurt.
Oh yeah. But I kept being obedient and doing what he would ask me to do. And it would play out to be extremely wise. And especially as we're trying to turn around this troubled bank, we had a lot of really challenging situations that we needed a lot of great wisdom. And this guy just kept pouring it into me, but he was applying the Bible every step of the way. And to look back, I really didn't feel like at the time that he was evangelizing. I felt like this was truly how he did business. And he thought that the Bible was the best roadmap he was going to find to turn around this troubled bank. And so I remember looking back at those years as a kid, knowing the Bible fairly well, but no one ever made it practical. And so for this guy to make it practical and to see it work had a huge impact on me, because I began to think, maybe there's more to that book that I learned as a child than I ever imagined. And maybe I need to be paying attention to what's going on here.
What were your other peers saying about the experience?
They didn't know what to think, because they still had this CEO there that was the previous guy, and they had been reporting to him for years, and the way he was running the bank was nothing like what they were starting to see. And so it was really hard on them, and they didn't trust him or me for that matter. And I remember a moment that happened that I think changed the whole nature and the culture of that bank. Was Greg realized that the rest of these people were still following the former guy, and they were ignoring us, but we needed to take command of the situation and move things forward. And so one day Greg came in and announced to the entire bank, tomorrow I want you all to park your cars out back of the bank, because tomorrow I'm going to spend the whole day washing cars of the employees. Now, with my mindset, I made a beeline for him and said, Greg, this is a terrible idea. You're the bank president. They should be washing your car. We need these people to get on board with who's the boss around here. And he just smiled at me and said, Rick, do you remember the parable in the Bible about, or not the parable, but the story in the Bible about Jesus washing the feet of the disciples? I'm like, yeah, I remember that, but that doesn't cut it here. That doesn't work.
That was Jesus, your CEO.
Yeah. And he just smiled and he said, I got this, Rick. I know what I'm doing. And sure enough, after that day of him serving these employees in that humble manner, all of a sudden, the whole tone of that place changed. And I began watching people saying, if he's willing to serve me, maybe I need to be willing to serve him.
So did they just sit there and watch him out the windows?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They just marveled at this bank president's out there, because it was such a contrast to the former guy that they had never seen anything like that.
And what are you doing? Just shaking your head? Or
yeah, I'm just shaking my head saying, this is a bad idea. This is not going to work out well. But it did.
And so, that's wearing on you now, right? You're beginning to think are you thinking there's something to this, or this guy's just still loony, or what's going on? What's happening in the bank too along this time?
Yeah, well, the bank was turning around. I mean, we were told by the regional guy that they had budgeted and expected it was a 3-year turnaround. We actually turned it around in about a year and a half. And things were getting profitable, and it was headed in the right direction. And we were making a lot of hard decisions, but we were handling it well. And I felt like God was just kind of showing him a way forward to lead us in that. And so it was working out. But I was still skeptical, but yet I'm being chipped away at. because God's just kind of softening my heart, saying, maybe there's something to this stuff. And so what ended up happening is after about 8 or 9 months of working for that guy, my in-laws decided to take us to Hawaii on vacation. And long story short, God decided this was the perfect opportunity to hit me right over the head with a 2x4 and get me the rest away to where he was trying to get me. Because one day my brother-in-law and I went out boogie boarding with a bunch of surfers around us. And one minute I'm with all these surfers, and the next minute I am out in the middle of the ocean all by myself with just this boogie board. And I had gotten sucked into a riptide that had just really sucked me further and further offshore. And at the worst of it, Gene, all I could see was the very top of the high rises, way off in the distance. And I think I was probably close to a mile offshore. And I'm just swimming for all I'm worth, and I'm not making any headway to getting out of this riptide. And I finally loosened the band off of the boogie board so I could swim unhindered and push that board. And this huge wave hit, and I watched my boogie board sail off in the distance. And I panicked. I realized I've got to get to that board. I can't survive this far offshore. And as I started to try and swim for that board, my legs cramped because I'd been mountain bike riding all morning. And so all of a sudden I have no board, my legs aren't working, I'm a mile offshore, I'm getting burned in the sun, and I'm scared, and I'm wondering, how am I going to survive this? And as I rack my brain for a solution to this, I finally turned back to, the only solution is God. If there's a God and he decides to save me, then I have hope. If there's not a God, then I'm in bad way. And so for the first time in 20 years, I began praying that day, and just began praying and just asking God to forgive me for the life that I'd lived, and that I knew I'd messed it all up. And what really broke my heart that day, Gene, was my wife was on the shore looking for me, but our daughter was 6 months old and was with her. And I remember thinking, who's going to raise my daughter and who's going to help my wife? And that broke me. And that's really when my prayers turned very sincere. And after that prayer, I felt the peace of God just sweep over me. And I instantly knew that God was real. And then this huge wave hit. And this time the wave drove me underwater, just somersault after somersault, pushing me through the ocean. And I popped up and got some air and got hit with another one, and down I went again, and my lungs were bursting. And that happened about 3 times. And finally, the third time I popped up, I could finally see the shore off in the distance. But I looked around and I saw a couple of young boys on a surfboard about 100 yards from me. And with the last strength that I could muster, I shouted for those 2 boys. And fortunately, they got to me quickly, and they fished me out of that ocean and plopped me over on their surfboard. And these 2 boys paddled me into the beach. They dumped me on the beach, and they left me.
You're on dry ground. You're fine.
Yeah. And my wife eventually found me sprawled out on the beach. And the first thing I told her was, when we get back to Kansas City, we're going to find a church and we're going to get right with God.
And what did she say to that?
And she was like, what in the world has happened to you? But we did. We went back, we found a church, and we got plugged in, and we started growing in Christ. And I started going back to that bank with a different perspective, saying, teach me more. I want to know more about what the Bible has to say about business, because business was always my passion.
So what were some of the early changes? You said obviously a new attitude as you were going to work. What are some other things you remember about that initial coming back to Jesus?
I would say, Gene, one of the biggest hurdles for me was I had been such a heavy drinker for so long. And, the church I was raised in as a kid, it was a sin to even take a drink, let alone, get drunk like I was doing every weekend. Mm-hmm. And so I remember that was one of the big things that held me back from wanting to be a Christian, was I didn't want to feel like I had to give up drinking. And, along the way, I felt God's grace that I didn't have to give up drinking, but he started changing my heart that I wanted to give up drinking. And so, it really kind of took a turn for me. And it took time. I just originally it was okay. I know I can't get drunk. I know I shouldn't be doing that. So I toned it down a lot, and then just gradually over time, due to some other circumstances, not that I had any conviction that you can't drink, as much as just personally, God was convicting me that He wanted me to give that up. And so I did. And so that was an area that I really had to work on and change. And it took some time, and God had to work on me with that. But it was just one of those obedience questions that I had to decide, am I going to obey God and what He's asking me to do personally or not?
And what's happening relationally with Jesus now?
Yeah, so I was getting into a good small group. I was learning about trying to have some quiet time and read God's word. And so I was growing and hungry to learn from God's word, and was surrounded by a lot of great people that were teaching me and showing me a path forward. And so God was really doing some transformation in my life as I began learning to pray, and as I began learning to study God's word on a regular basis, and to start figuring out, well, how do I apply this stuff? And I think what helped me was seeing that bank president applying it in business, because that was such an area of passion for me. So it was easier to say, well, if I'm supposed to be applying it in business, then I guess I need to apply it in my personal life as well.
Yeah. That's so funny, because it's opposite for most people, right?
Yes.
They apply it to their personal life first and go, oh, well, maybe this somehow applies to business, but you went the other direction.
Yeah.
And of course, with your CPA, education and background, being in banking for a while, you understood the fundamentals of business, obviously.
Yes.
And then you had an experience so few people back in that day would even imagine,
Right.
this nut quoting proverbs and parables to you to go solve how to take care of a delinquent loan,
It seemed like a very radical place to be at that time. And he was radical in a lot of ways, because, I remember he was my age, but he had, at the time, he had 6 kids. He was homeschooling all of them. They didn't own a TV. And I'm like, who does that stuff?
So he was out there.
He was, yeah.
He gave you every reason not to understand.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It was hard to swallow at times.
Yeah. So we have to talk about God's humor here a little bit, because I know where we're headed with the Unconventional Business Network. But do you just look back and crack up how God was preparing you for what He had in mind?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I could have never charted the path. I mean, I've always loved small business. And so looking back, I had choices along the way. Public accounting. I worked for a firm that they let me work with small businesses rather than the large ones. I worked with some large ones, but by and large, I was usually engaged with smaller companies, which was a deep passion for me. And then even in banking, there were times when I was invited to go to the downtown bank and be a big company lender. But I chose to be a community banker, that I could serve the small business community. And so there was always this pathway for me working with small business entrepreneurs and working with people at the top of those organizations. And even being an entrepreneur myself at 25 years old, I mean, you couldn't have picked a more pivotal moment to try and start a business at the highest interest rates in the history, really, of this country, and the worst unemployment at the time. So whenever I've had to counsel business people over the years, there's very few that they can throw at me that I can't say I've been there and done that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So then you transitioned out of the community bank into consulting. Tell us about that and what was going on.
Yeah. So I had shifted into a small community bank that I was helping to run and was part owner in, and we decided to sell it to a major holding company. So during that time, I was praying about what God wanted me to do next. And I had, because of that car rental agency experience, I had sworn off ever being an entrepreneur again. But God started revealing to me that he wanted me to help train and equip business leaders to apply God's word like that bank president did with me.
Mhm.
And so I started looking around the country to see, are there any ministries out there that I could join? And I wasn't finding anything that was like what I had on my heart. And so God started really pressing in on me that he wanted me to take another entrepreneurial venture and go start a consulting practice that would begin applying originally biblical truths to business. And it was scary. I didn't want to do it. I wrestled with God for a while, but he really leaned into me in a way that I knew I would be disobedient if I didn't. And
Mhm.
so I started a consulting practice. And the irony was, when I was struggling, Gene, with that decision, and I really didn't want to be an entrepreneur again, I remember saying, okay, Lord, if I fold and I agree to go do this, would you at least provide for the startup phase? Because that was the area of most concern for me. And I
Right.
didn't really even know at the time what that meant. I just remember saying, God, if I do this, would you at least provide for that startup phase? And once I made that commitment, the very first phone call I had was from Greg, that old bank president. And he called and said, Rick, I don't know what you're getting ready to do now that you've sold the bank, but I was up all night last night with my wife praying about my career. And I think I'm supposed to throw in with you and do some kind of ministry work to business people. Does that mean anything to you?
Unbelievable.
And
Did you
I
drop
just
the
laughed and
phone?
I said, this guy loves to start up banks and then he gets bored and moves on. Yes, yeah, you can help me with this. And so he and I started the consulting practice and we got it off the ground. We developed a business planning model using the book of Nehemiah as a guide that we could take those biblical principles into small businesses and help them develop a practical plan that they could work out for their company. And so as we started to do that, and as Greg helped me get this thing off the ground and get it rolling, my wife came down with breast cancer at the time, and I needed to be home a lot. And so Greg really was laying the foundation for that consulting practice. He was really kind of supporting both families to a great extent and helping get things rolling. And when my wife finished her last round of chemo, Greg came into the office one day and said, I can't fully understand what God's up to, but he's made it clear to me that this is your baby, not mine. And that now that it's off the ground, God's called me to go back to banking. So good luck. And so he left and it was off the ground and I took the reins and started rolling along with this consulting practice that was doing this biblical model that no one else had ever thought of or had ever heard of before.
So, who were your first clients? I mean, this is so out there, brand new at this point. 20 years ago, people are not even talking about this, except
they thought I was
your nutty
crazy.
friend Greg. So, how did you approach people?
It was really interesting to watch how God worked in that, because initially in the Kansas City area, I remember thinking, gosh, there surely aren't enough Christian business owners that are going to be willing to pay me to do this. How am I going to survive?
Yeah.
But I sent out a marketing piece and just doing a survey asking people about planning and how much planning they do and whether or not it's important and what principles they use to guide it, and just a survey. And I sent it out to people that I had in my database from my banking days. And I remember the first guy that responded was my worst bank customer, and not worst from a financial standpoint. He was probably my best financially, but he was one of those win-lose kind of guys, and that he had to win in every deal and everything was a competition. And I absolutely hated working with him.
Mm-hmm.
He was the first one that called me and said, you need to come meet with me. And I'm like, no, anybody but him. And I go meet with this guy, and I walked into his office, and the minute I saw his eyes, I knew his life was different than what I had known before. And he told me an amazing story of how he had picked up a homeless guy, and this homeless guy had brought him to Christ, and that he wanted to do things differently than what he had done in the past whenever I had known him. And so he hired me to help him with his company. And I'm like, how strange is this?
Yes,
And so that was one of my very first clients. And then Larry Burkett had a ministry in Atlanta, Georgia, called Crown Ministries. That at that time was actually called Christian Financial Concepts. And he learned of what I was doing, and I'd done a lot of work with them. And when they learned what I was doing, they called and said, we have this national radio program with lots of people that call in for counseling every day. And a lot of times they're small business owners calling for help. And Rick, we don't know what to do with them. Would you mind if we started referring those calls to you? And so they began referring these counseling calls to me from all around the country. And at the peak of it, I was helping over 600 businesses a year through crisis. And, a lot of them were in crisis and couldn't afford to hire me. So a lot of it was pro bono, but there were occasionally those that could afford to hire me. And so I started being able to do some of these plans with companies from all around the country. And it was just a remarkable journey to watch what God was doing.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you transition to Unconventional Business Network? What happened to get to that?
So over time, because Crown was referring all that to me, they also started asking me to teach their business by the book seminar around the country, which I did. And I came out with my own first book called Unconventional Business. Well, ultimately, there was one kind of right before that. And I began seeing that we were doing more teaching, more counseling, more stuff than just the consulting. And so in 2001, my board kind of woke up to that reality and said, Rick, God's doing some really cool things around here, but it really doesn't look like a consulting practice anymore as much as it looks like a ministry. And why don't we form a nonprofit organization and embrace what God obviously is up to and go that direction? And so in 2001, we actually formed a 501c3 nonprofit and began the journey of shifting out of that consulting practice into doing more one-to-many, because the consulting was kind of one-to-one. Mm-hmm. And what I felt like God was calling me to was, Rick, I've kind of prepared you with this one-to-one consulting, with some of the teaching and counseling you're doing. Now I need people in the Faith at Work movement to start teaching one-to-many and reaching thousands of people instead of just dozens. And so that's kind of what we did, and we moved in that direction.
And where did you come up with the name?
Well, originally the name was Integrity Resource Center.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And over time, I had written a book called Unconventional Business. And I went away on a prayer retreat at our 15-year anniversary of the ministry. And all I heard all day from the Lord was a verse out of Isaiah that don't look to the former things, I'm about to do something brand new. But God didn't tell me what that was. Mm-hmm. And so I left knowing, okay, I need to keep my eyes and ears open. And immediately I had a guy that had been doing some coaching and consulting work trying to help us in the ministry, came to me and he said, Rick, that book, Unconventional Business, is a much better brand than Integrity Resource Center. Have you ever thought about changing your brand? And my initial thought to him was, I have 15 years of brand equity. That's too much work. I'm not going to do it.
Exactly.
And he said, he just smiled and he said, you're not even willing to pray about it? I'm like, oh, I hate it when people pull the prayer card out on me. I'm like, okay, I will pray about it.
With a sincere heart, of course.
Yeah. And within a couple of weeks, I had two other major stakeholders in the ministry call me with the exact same idea. I'm like, okay, Lord, I guess this is a sign of what you're wanting me to do. Mm-hmm. And so we embraced that and began making that brand transition. And so it's been a much better brand to create curiosity and for
Yes.
people to ask questions. Well, what does it mean to be an unconventional business?
Exactly, exactly. And so the book, it sounds like the genesis of the book then was part of your journey from one to one to one to many. So tell us about the book, Unconventional Business.
Yeah, when I used to teach the business by the book workshop that Larry Burkett originally wrote, people would leave at the end of the day and they would say to me, okay, Rick, I now understand why I'm supposed to be doing this stuff in my business, but who can tell me how?
Hmm.
And so I knew we needed to have a book out there that could kind of address the how to. And so I wrote this unconventional business book of saying, okay, planning, finance, sales, marketing, all of these disciplines in business that we all have to do. How do I do it from a biblical worldview? And so I really wrote the book as a practical guide of how to take the Bible and apply it to those day to day decisions, much like Greg did with me in that bank early on. How do I help people really take the Bible and transition it into a practical tool in their business? And so that was the intent behind writing the book, Unconventional Business.
And what do you think are two or three highlights from the book that you really like?
I wove the story of Nehemiah all the way through the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so the book kind of begins with planning and how Nehemiah planned out his approach to leaving being a cupbearer and going to a foreign city that he didn't even know and raising up people that he didn't even know into a project of rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. There's so many great principles in that. And so I wove his story through the whole tone of the book of being able to kind of point to lessons learned from that, but also then taking practical scripture and applying it to, like personnel issues.
Mm-hmm.
How do I handle conflict in the workplace? How do I handle hiring and firing from a way that would be more in alignment with God's word, and having compassion and doing it in a godly manner rather than, hey, they're just a cog in this big wheel. Let's chew them up and spit them out if they're no longer useful to the business. And so
Right.
the book was designed to kind of contrast the world's way of doing business versus an unconventional approach that Jesus might exercise if he were here running a business.
Let's talk a little bit more specifically about UBM, because you know what some people are going to ask, and you've seen it firsthand so many times now. Why does the Bible work in business? I mean,
Yeah.
really?
Well, I think it works because it's relevant, it's practical, and it's been time tested for thousands of years. You can look all through scripture and you can find all kinds of amazing stories of how God had an unconventional answer to the problems that the Bible characters were trying to solve. I mean, you think of stories like Joshua being told to take these hundreds of thousands of warriors and to tell them to march instead around the walls of Jericho and blow a bunch of horns and let God have the victory instead of them being able to say, look what great warriors you are. I mean, there are so many stories like that throughout scripture where God gives us unconventional approaches that I think it's just a powerful, relevant story if we're humble enough to pray and ask God, what's the unconventional approach you want me to use, Lord, in this business today with this situation that I'm confronted with today?
And what have been some of you, of course, I have 3,000 questions now. Tell me a little bit, what are some of the hardest obstacles you've seen for you to sit down and go, okay, because you're having a process, what are the biblical principles? What's going on here? What are the motivations? There's a ton of stuff going on in these situations. What's one of the more challenging situations you have where you could say, okay, here's the biblical principle?
Usually I would say it's around people. People and conflict issues are always a challenge in business. And, so many leaders think, boy, business would be fun if it wasn't for the people.
Right.
But they oftentimes handle it inappropriately compared to the way scripture would. So a good example is, I recently had a situation to where, someone approached me about uh, a conflict they were having with someone else, and they wanted me to be in the middle of it. And I got in the middle of it, and about halfway through, it dawned on me I had just violated Matthew 18 that says when you have a problem, go one to one. And so I had to go back to these two parties and say, no, you two are supposed to be working this out before you drag me into the middle of this. I shouldn't have gotten in the middle of this. I apologize. Let's do it the right way. And the right way ended up being a lot better way because they had a strong enough relationship. They were just having a little tiff. And so they were able to kind of work it out with each other. And there's those kinds of principles from scripture that it's easy to take the world's path and just charge in and say, okay, I'm just going to take care of this problem and not be prayerful and thoughtful about how God would rather us do it. And so there's just a lot of conflict that happens in business, and it's a very common issue.
Exceptional answer. I really appreciate that. So talk to me a little bit about as you visit with, your audience is Christian leaders or owners of companies.
Right.
And what are some of the obstacles when you first start talking to them about, you can live your faith at work? What are the common things you have to overcome?
Yeah, the first one is almost always fear. We have been so brainwashed as a culture of this separation of church and state mythology of what it really means, that a lot of people think, boy, if I bring any element of my faith into the workplace, I'm going to get sued. I can't do this. This is dangerous. And so many people shy away from it. And so we first usually have to have the discussion of what does the law really have to say about this, and what can you legally do? And then it kind of helps free them up of saying, okay, well, at least I can put that one to rest. Now I can focus and move forward. So fear is always a major obstacle. I'd say another one is lack of understanding of what it really means, because we're such a biblically illiterate society now that many people, especially a lot of the younger generation, have not been in church. They haven't been exposed to the Bible. And so all they know is, the things that they may hear from the press and stuff that they may have bought into. And so they don't really have a keen understanding of what scripture actually teaches and how it might be helpful to them in the business world. And so we have to try and help overcome that as well and start teaching and equipping them to better understand what scripture actually says.
Yes. And then talk to me a little bit about the improved business metrics. Do you see businesses improving, relationships? What's the empirical evidence that this is a good idea?
Yeah. Well, I think, business people are very practical people. And so they're looking for practicality in applying scripture. Yeah. But it also requires that infused with that is a heart change. And so they have to be obedient and be willing to actually implement and do the things that they feel like God's asking or calling them to do. But when they do that, the fruit that comes out of it is multifaceted. For example, we want, and God wants, business leaders to have a generous heart and a generous mindset. The world says make as much as you can, keep as much as you can, and invest it in yourself. And who cares about everybody around you? More for me is kind of the world's approach. God's approach is more a generous approach, and that he actually asks us to commit, whether you, agree that it's a tithe or more. I don't think anybody can build much of an argument that it's less. But God wants us to be open-handed and generous with what He has given us. And so it's kind of fun when we help businesses realize that even businesses have profits that they can tithe out of. And different people do that different ways because of different corporate structures that happen in the IRS eyes. Right. But nevertheless, the concept is being generous. And so recently I had a call from a company that we've worked with over the years. And they called and said, Rick, we've been faithfully tithing off of our net profit in our company for many years. And recently God's been convicting our leadership team that maybe we're at a place that we could actually tithe off of the gross revenue in our business. But this is a scary proposition.
Yeah.
What do you think? And we talked through it, we prayed through it, and they made the plunge. And they said, yeah, we actually can make it work financially. God's blessed us. We want to give back even more. And so they've stepped up recently, and they're starting to give so generously that they're now tithing off of their gross revenue instead of their net.
So the famous quote from Billy Graham, he believed the next big movement from God would be in the marketplace. Yes. How are you seeing that come true from all this?
Yeah, when I started in this over 26 years ago now, there was probably less than 25 ministries in the country that were faith at work oriented. And today there's literally thousands of them, and they're popping up all the time. And so I've seen God at work in this movement and moving more and more people to talk about it. And so I'm no longer viewed as the kook that I was in the early years, because now these people have heard something about faith at work oftentimes. And so it's not as hard dirt as it was early on. And so those pioneering days feel like they're paying off now, as I'm seeing other people just locking arms with me, and we're collaborating and trying to move the kingdom forward through this faith at work movement. So it's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And then in conclusion, what do you say to the Rick Boxx of 25 years ago? He's had some experience with faith at work. He's becoming more convicted that he ought to do something. What's your message to that man or woman?
Yeah, I'd say be bold and step into it and trust that God can have your back. It's scary, and it was scary for us when we started. We'd never run a nonprofit organization. We didn't know if we could fund enough to keep my family alive. And, it's a scary venture, but God is so faithful and He shows up. And so I think if people just step into whatever the next step is that God's asking you to do, He's probably not going to show you all the steps down the road, because if He did, it would scare you half to death and you'd stay at home. Right. But He'll show you the next step, and He'll show you how to get through the next step. But He's asking you to be bold and take that next step. And, for a business owner, that may simply mean, being a little bolder about what drives their decisions. And, okay, if I want to use the Bible as a guide, do I tell my employees that, or do I hide it? Well, be bold. Let them see that this is the guidebook that you're using, and that it actually works, just like Greg did for me at that bank all those years ago.
Yeah. Now, would you recommend they all go wash the cars of their direct reports, or is it more situational?
I think it's more situational. That may not work for you in that particular day, but being a servant leader tends to always work out pretty well.
Yes, exactly. Well, this has been fascinating, Rick. I mean, here you are, a guy who is out there doing it, showing people how they can live their faith at work, transforming the workplace, transforming their lives. And as you mentioned several times, actually taking the principles back into their home and into their personal life. It's such a shame that, as you said earlier, that Christ has been lost in the noise, that there was this huge wall built between church and work. And we just didn't even think about taking our faith to work, and how wonderful that can be. So I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Gene. This has been just a blast to hang out with you today.
Thank you. Likewise.